They've met empaths before, people who felt deeply, gave endlessly, and stayed even when it hurt. But this one is different. This one doesn't chase. This one doesn't break. This one doesn't lose themselves trying to understand you. And that's the moment everything changes. Because when an avoidant meets a healed empath, the old patterns don't work anymore. At first, it feels familiar. The avoidant senses warmth, emotional intelligence, someone who can understand without needing too many words. And the healed empath, they recognize the distance, the subtle pulling back, the emotional walls that most people try to climb. But here's the difference. A healed empath doesn't chase connection. They observe it. And that observation disrupts the entire dynamic, because avoidants rely on a predictable pattern. Closeness followed by distance. Interest followed by withdrawal. And most people respond the same way. They pursue harder. They don't chase. And that simple difference changes everything. Because in almost every emotional dynamic you've ever seen play out, there is a hidden pattern running underneath the surface. One person leans in, the other pulls away. One pursues, the other retreats, and the entire system survives on imbalance. Not love, not connection, but the nervous system reacting to uncertainty. Now here's where the shift begins. When a healed empath enters that system, the pattern collapses, not loudly, not dramatically, but silently and completely, because a healed empath no longer feeds the chase cycle. They don't rush to close emotional gaps. They don't over-explain to be understood. They don't increase effort when someone withdraws. And to an outside observer, that might look like distance. But neurologically, it's regulation. Because the human brain is not just responding to words in relationships. It is responding to patterns of reward and uncertainty. Dopamine, the brain's motivation chemical, is not released when you receive love consistently. It spikes when reward is unpredictable. This is the same mechanism behind addiction loops and gambling behavior. Not knowing when the next reward comes keeps the brain engaged. That's why inconsistent relationships feel more intense than stable ones. Not because they are healthier, but because they are chemically more activating. Now enter the healed empath. They do something that disrupts this system entirely. They remove emotional unpredictability from their side. They do not overextend. They do not collapse emotionally when someone withdraws. They do not rush to repair distance that they did not create. And in doing so, they stop feeding the nervous system loop. At first, this creates discomfort in the other person. The brain of someone used to emotional chasing expects activation. It expects reaction. It expects pursuit to restore balance. But instead, it receives consistency, calm responses, no escalation, no emotional flooding. And this creates what neuroscientists call prediction error. The brain predicts a response and does not receive it. When prediction error occurs, the brain becomes highly attentive. It begins scanning more deeply, analyzing behavior, trying to regain control of the emotional pattern it understands. This is where most people misunderstand what is happening. They assume silence or calmness is weakness. But in neuroscience, emotional neutrality in the face of unpredictability is actually a dominance signal, because it indicates internal regulation. No panic response, no dependency activation, no emotional collapse. The system stays stable, regardless of external behavior. And that stability is rare. Most people unconsciously mirror emotional chaos. If someone pulls away, they panic. If someone becomes distant, they chase. If someone becomes inconsistent, they try harder. But the healed empath does not mirror instability. They interrupt it. And that interruption breaks the chase cycle completely. Because now there is no resistance to push against, no emotional pressure to trigger pursuit behavior, no anxiety spike that forces reconnection attempts. Instead, there is something unfamiliar. Space without pursuit, presence without demand, connection without urgency. And the nervous system of the other person does not know how to categorize it at first. So it does what all brains do when faced with uncertainty. It observes, it analyzes, it recalibrates. This is where attachment psychology becomes important. Avoidant and anxious attachment systems are built on expectation of instability. One expects abandonment and chases to prevent it. The other expects engulfment and withdraws to maintain control. But a healed empath does neither. They remain present without overinvesting. They remain open without attachment anxiety. They respond without emotional escalation. And this creates something extremely rare in human interaction: a non-threatening emotional field. In that field, the nervous system can downregulate stress responses, Cortisol levels decrease when perceived threat is absent. Heart rate variability improves when emotional unpredictability is reduced. The body literally begins to feel safer. But here is the key point most people miss. This safety does not come from chasing less. It comes from needing less. And that changes everything in how they behave. Because need creates pressure, and pressure creates avoidance. But absence of need creates space, and space creates curiosity. So when a healed empath does not chase, they are not playing a strategy. They are embodying a regulated nervous system. They are no longer trying to resolve emotional discomfort through external validation. They are allowing discomfort to exist without reacting to it. And that alone rewires the interaction. Because now the other person is no longer dealing with emotional pursuit. They are dealing with emotional stability. And stability cannot be manipulated the same way chaos can. You cannot trigger panic responses if there is no panic. You cannot create pursuit if there is no chasing energy to escape from. So the entire dynamic shifts. What was once push and pull becomes observation. What was once anxiety becomes curiosity. What was once control-seeking behavior becomes self-reflection. And slowly, the chase pattern dies. Not because it was stopped, but because it was no longer sustained. And here is the deeper psychological truth. When someone stops chasing, it does not just change the relationship. It changes their identity. Because every time you resist the urge to chase, you strengthen prefrontal cortex regulation pathways in the brain. This is the area responsible for impulse control, emotional regulation, and long-term decision-making. Over time, the brain becomes less reactive, less dependent on external validation, more stable in self-perception. And that stability is what creates real emotional power, not control over others, but control over the self. Because when you are no longer governed by emotional urgency, you begin to see patterns clearly. You begin to recognize inconsistency without attachment. You begin to feel emotional distance without panic. You begin to engage without losing yourself. And that is the moment everything shifts. Because at that level, you are no longer participating in the chase cycle at all. You are outside of it, observing it, no longer driven by it. And once that happens, you cannot be pulled back into the same pattern the same way again. Because you are no longer the person who needs to chase. You are the person who understands why chasing was never the answer in the first place. When emotional pressure disappears, something unexpected happens inside the human brain. It doesn't relax immediately. It recalibrates. Because for most people trapped in inconsistent emotional dynamics, the nervous system is not seeking love, it is seeking predictability. And predictability, even in unhealthy forms, feels safer than uncertainty. This is where everything begins to shift when a healed empath enters the dynamic, because they do something that the nervous system of the other person has rarely, if ever, experienced before. They stay present without pressure. They remain engaged without emotional escalation. They offer connection without demand. And at first, the brain does not know how to interpret this. Because in most relational systems, emotional presence comes with conditions. If you are close, you must maintain intensity. If you care, you must prove it. If you stay, you must pursue. But a healed empath removes that entire equation. And neuroscience tells us what happens next. When the brain is exposed to expected emotional reward patterns, and those patterns are suddenly removed, it enters a state called prediction error processing. Dopamine neurons fire not just when we receive reward, but when we anticipate it. So when someone consistently expects emotional pursuit, validation, or reaction and it doesn't arrive, the brain becomes hyper-attentive. It starts scanning for meaning. Not because it feels safe, but because it feels uncertain. And uncertainty is one of the strongest attention drivers in human cognition. This is why inconsistent emotional environments feel so addictive. They keep the brain searching for resolution. But the healed empath does something different. They do not increase intensity to match withdrawal. They do not chase inconsistency with more effort. They do not try to repair distance through emotional overextension. Instead, they remain stable. And stability is where the system breaks. Because now there is no emotional spike to regulate, no chaos to escape from, no intensity to balance. Just calm, consistent presence. And for a nervous system that has been conditioned to expect volatility, this creates confusion. But not the kind of confusion that pushes away, the kind that pulls inward. Because the brain cannot predict them anymore. And when prediction fails repeatedly, the mind begins to pay closer attention. It studies tone. It studies behavior. It studies absence of reaction. It tries to map a pattern that no longer exists. And this is where emotional safety begins to form. Not through words, not through reassurance, but through the absence of threat. In psychological research on attachment systems, safety is not defined by closeness alone. It is defined by the absence of perceived danger during closeness. When someone can be emotionally present without triggering defensive responses, the nervous system gradually lowers its guard. Cortisol levels begin to stabilize. The amygdala, the brain's fear processing center, reduces hyperactivity. And the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for rational thinking and emotional regulation, regains control. In simple terms, the body stops preparing to escape. But here's the paradox. The healed empath is not doing this to create attachment. They are doing it because they are no longer abandoning themselves in emotional interactions. And that distinction changes everything. Because most people confuse emotional availability with emotional dependence. They believe that to be close, they must overextend. That to maintain connection, they must constantly prove value. That to prevent distance, they must increase effort. But a regulated nervous system does not operate from fear of loss. It operates from internal stability. So when a healed empath interacts, they are not trying to secure the bond. They are observing it. They are present but not attached to outcome. Engaged but not dependent on response. Open but not compromised in self-awareness. And this creates a completely different emotional field. One that does not trigger survival responses in the same way. Because there is no pressure, no urgency, no emotional demand. And in that absence, something subtle begins to happen. The other person starts to feel safe. Not immediately, not consciously, but physiologically. The body responds before the mind understands. Heart rate slows during interaction instead of accelerating. Breathing becomes less shallow. Muscle tension decreases during communication instead of increasing. These are not emotional decisions. These are nervous system responses. And over time, this repeated experience of non-threatening interaction creates a new association. Connection without fear. Presence without pressure. Engagement without emotional chaos. But here is where most people misunderstand what is happening. They assume this creates instant attachment. It does not. It creates space for attachment to develop naturally. Because the nervous system is no longer in survival mode. An attachment formed in survival mode is not stable attachment. It is reactive bonding. It is driven by anxiety, inconsistency, and emotional spikes. But attachment formed in regulated environments behaves differently. It develops slowly. It stabilizes over time. It is based on trust rather than fear. And trust, in neuroscience, is built through repeated experiences of predictability. So when a healed empath does not chase, when they do not overreact, when they do not collapse emotionally in response to distance, they are not withholding love. They are removing instability. And instability is what most emotional systems unconsciously revolve around, because instability creates engagement, but it does not create peace. So what happens next is critical. The avoidant or emotionally inconsistent person begins to experience something unfamiliar. They do not feel pursued, but they do not feel rejected either. They do not feel pressured, but they do not feel abandoned. They feel something much more subtle. They feel space. And in that space, curiosity begins to form, because the brain cannot resolve what it cannot categorize. And what cannot be categorized becomes attention-grabbing. This is where emotional recalibration begins, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through experience. The experience of being met without being chased, the experience of withdrawing without being pursued, the experience of distance without emotional collapse from the other side. And over time, this rewires expectation, because the nervous system learns a new pattern. Connection does not require chaos. Closeness does not require intensity. Presence does not require pressure. And that realization shifts behavior, but only if the healed empath remains consistent. Because the moment they abandon their regulation and revert to chasing, the old pattern returns instantly, not because the connection was false, but because the nervous system defaults to what it has learned most consistently. So the real power of emotional safety is not in creating attachment in others. It is in maintaining internal regulation regardless of their behavior. Because that is what creates a different outcome entirely, not dependency, not anxiety, not push and pull cycles, but stability. And stability is what most people have never experienced in emotional connection. not because it is rare in others, but because it is rare in themselves. And once that changes, everything else changes with it. When someone finally stops trying to win people, something deeper begins to happen inside them. Not emotionally, but structurally. Because the human brain is not just a thinking organ, it is a pattern learning system. And every relationship you enter becomes data. Every compromise, every boundary you ignored, every time you stayed when you should have left. It all gets recorded in neural pathways that shape how you see yourself. And over time, that data becomes identity. This is why people don't just get over certain emotional patterns easily, because they are not just breaking habits. They are rewriting a nervous system that learned survival through attachment. And attachment, in evolutionary terms, is one of the strongest survival systems we have. For thousands of years, being disconnected from a group meant danger. Isolation meant threat. So the brain evolved to prioritize connection over self-abandonment, even when that connection was unhealthy, even when it required sacrifice, even when it slowly eroded self-respect. That's why people chase. That's why people tolerate inconsistency. That's why people overinvest in emotionally unavailable dynamics. Not because they lack intelligence, but because their nervous system is prioritizing attachment survival over emotional truth. And this is where the healed empath becomes fundamentally different, because they begin to interrupt that survival loop, not by shutting off emotion, but by no longer letting emotion override self-alignment. And that shift is not psychological alone. It is biological. Studies in neuroplasticity show that repeated behavioral changes, especially those involving emotional restraint and boundary enforcement, physically rewire synaptic connections in the brain. New pathways form, old ones weaken. This is how identity changes at a neurological level. So every time a person chooses not to chase, every time they sit with discomfort instead of reacting, every time they allow distance without collapsing emotionally, they are literally reshaping their brain. Strengthening the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control and long-term decision-making, and reducing overactivation in the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. In simple terms, they become less reactive, more stable, more self-directed. But this transformation does something even more important. It changes perception. Because when you stop chasing validation from others, you start seeing people clearly, not through emotional need, not through attachment distortion, but through behavioral reality. You stop confusing attention with consistency. You stop confusing intensity with compatibility. You stop confusing emotional highs with emotional safety. And that clarity is uncomfortable at first, because it removes illusion. But it also removes dependency. And dependency is what keeps most emotional cycles alive. So when a healed empath refuses to chase, they are not just changing how they interact with others. They are changing what they tolerate internally. They are no longer willing to abandon themselves for temporary connection. And that is a psychological threshold most people never cross, because the brain resists it. It creates withdrawal-like sensations, the urge to text, the urge to explain, the urge to fix what feels emotionally unresolved. These urges are not emotional weakness. They are neurochemical responses tied to dopamine expectation loops. The brain anticipates relief from reconnection, and when that relief is delayed, discomfort increases. But here is the critical shift. A healed empath learns to sit in that discomfort without obeying it. And that is where emotional freedom begins. Because freedom is not the absence of feeling. It is the absence of compulsion. You can feel everything without needing to act on everything. And that is where most people lose themselves. They confuse emotional intensity with emotional truth. They think the strongest feeling must be the most important signal. But neuroscience tells us otherwise. High emotional arousal actually reduces cognitive accuracy, meaning the more emotionally activated you are, the less clearly you see reality. So chasing someone from an activated state is not clarity, it is distortion. And the healed empath begins to recognize this. They begin to understand that not every emotional impulse deserves action. Not every connection deserves pursuit. Not every distance needs to be repaired immediately. And this creates a new internal hierarchy. Self-respect becomes more important than emotional resolution. Peace becomes more important than closure. Stability becomes more important than intensity. And this reordering changes behavior completely. Because now, instead of asking, how do I make them stay? They begin asking, does this dynamic align with who I am becoming? And that question is powerful enough to end entire cycles. because it removes emotional urgency from decision-making. It replaces reaction with observation, impulse with awareness, attachment with discernment, and over time, something remarkable happens. The emotional need to chase begins to fade, not because attraction disappears, but because identity strengthens. You stop being someone who reacts to emotional distance, and start being someone who evaluates emotional consistency. And that shift changes how others experience you, because people unconsciously respond to internal certainty. When someone is unsure of themselves, they invite instability into interactions. But when someone is internally grounded, they create a regulating effect in others, not through control, but through presence. And this is where paradox emerges. The less you chase, the more selective you become. The more selective you become, the more stable your emotional environment becomes. And the more stable your environment becomes, the less your nervous system feels the need to pursue instability. It becomes a self-reinforcing loop of calm, but only if you do not break it, because the old pattern will always try to return. The urge to over-explain, the urge to fix distance, the urge to re-enter cycles that feel familiar, even if they are not healthy. And this is why self-awareness becomes critical, because you are not just breaking a habit, you are breaking a neurological expectation. Your brain expects emotional chaos to be followed by emotional resolution. But when you no longer provide that cycle, it has to adapt. And adaptation is uncomfortable, but it is also where growth happens. So when a healed empath refuses to chase, they are not withdrawing from love. They are withdrawing from self-abandonment. They are no longer willing to sacrifice internal stability for external connection. And that is the deepest form of strength, not controlling others, not manipulating outcomes, but maintaining yourself regardless of emotional pressure. And once that becomes your baseline, you realize something most people never do. You were never meant to chase connection. You were meant to recognize what aligns with you and let everything else fall away.